In January 2012, as the SRC settled down to work, the Commission found out that the wage bill, even at that point in time, was already taking a huge chunk of the revenues generated internally and becoming unsustainable. In addition, there was a multitude of pending collective bargaining agreements that needed to be concluded and honored. Over and above all this, the public service was characterized by huge disparities and inequities and marked by substantial differences in salaries, in allowances, other benefits, and the grading, which resulted in discontent, low morale, and inefficiencies in the public service. Your Excellency, the Commission was also faced with a huge challenge of ensuring that the wage bill is affordable, while at the same time attracting to and retaining in the public sector the worker who will be able to deliver efficient and quality services to the taxpayer. These issues needed urgent attention and required that the Commission act with a lot of wisdom, tact, diligence, and resilience to identify areas of inequity and unfairness, quantifying the same and planning for quality harmonization. Your Excellency, I want to assure you and all the people of Kenya that the Commission has, since it was established, and even as we move forward, been and will remain equal to the task. The Commission is determined to work towards having a well and equitably remunerated public service that is a prerequisite to the attainment of the national policy objectives. Indeed, the Commission purposed to address the problem of the distorted public service wages that it inherited by using a system that is objective, scientific, and defensible. The first mandate was to set and review remuneration and benefits of state officers. We were clear in our minds that any job, office, or position, whether elective or appointive, that attracts remuneration and benefits can and should be measured to establish the relative worth of the job. The Commission undertook, therefore, a comprehensive job evaluation exercise for state officers and offices established by the Constitution, and a comparative analysis of the remuneration levels applicable in other comparable countries across the world. At the core of the proposed structure were the principles of sustainability, transparency, equity, and competitiveness. The remuneration determination was done by use of comparable economic factors like the GDP, the revenue collected, and the government expenditure. The need to reduce the disparities in remuneration levels between the highest and the lowest paid public officer was also taken into consideration. As we move on to carry out the job evaluation for the rest of the public service, the Commission is faced with even a greater task. That is to change the national mindset towards linking pay to performance. We need to link salaries and benefits to the overall performance of our country's economy. This is the most challenging factor. We are simply saying that the current public perception of mshahara wako ni mzigo wangu, this should change, and it needs to read mshahara wako ni baraka yangu. This is challenging, yet achievable. That is why SRC, after raising the red flag on several occasions about the threat of the ballooning wage bill to the economy, has opted to have the national debate we are inaugurating here today. The story about the wage bill is not an SRC creation. It's not an SRC story. It is a reality that we have to face as individuals, as leaders, and as a nation. If we don't, we will be forced to borrow, to keep the sick healed, to keep the poor sheltered, to educate our children, to have our farms watered, and so forth. SRC, just like all Kenyans, want nothing but for the economy to improve and to grow, and security to be better, business to thrive, and Kenyans to prosper. We can do it. The country and the counties are endowed with two very key resources, that is the human and the natural resources. This is a country that has proved time and again that it is a world beater, whether it is in athletics prowess, science and innovation, or even in business. Kenyans are well known for their ability. We only saw of the young lady the other day who just won an Oscar award, and it is a testimony that this country can achieve. All it needs is that we put that little extra effort into quality performance. We acknowledge that a lasting solution would be to have policy and legislation that govern management of remuneration and benefits in service. This will be informed by the national and the county debates, which we hope will be stimulating and constructive. As a people, we have purpose, strategy, and resolve. We call upon Kenyans to dedicate with a new urgency our every ounce of energy and moral strength to rebuild the fortunes of Kenya by contributing to these debates and making recommendations on public remuneration policy. Your Excellency, allow me to take this opportunity to salute you, the Deputy President, all Cabinet Secretaries and Principal Secretaries for voluntarily, and I repeat again, voluntarily taking pay cuts. Given the huge size of the wage bill, this is a bold move, indeed on top of being unprecedented. I am pleased to note that the reductions take effect, in fact, immediately. This is indeed leadership by example, as well as exemplary selflessness. I do now hope and pray that may your good spirit flow seamlessly to engulf all arms of government for the good and prosperity of this country. Indeed, in that spirit, I, as the chair of Salaries and Remuneration Commission, although working on a part-time basis, I am willing at this point to state that my allowance, my sitting allowance, should be reduced by 10%. As I conclude, sir, I want to wish all the speakers a very successful debate and assure you of SRC's commitment to fulfilling its constitutional mandate. It is now my humble duty to invite the Cabinet Secretary, Devolution and Planning, Madam Anne Waiguru, to make her remarks. Thank you very much, and may God bless all of us.
Your Excellency, the President of the Republic of Kenya and Chief of the Defense Forces, Honorable Uhuru Kenyatta, Your Excellency, the Deputy President, Honorable William Ruto, my fellow Cabinet colleagues who are present, Chairperson of the Salaries and Remuneration Commission, Principal Secretaries present, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Your Excellency, let me begin by thanking you for leading us from the front on a matter that threatens our fiscal and economic sustainability. Following your directive, my ministry, together with the National Treasury and various interagency task teams, were put together to initiate the discussion paper on the public sector wage bill. The task team has had various meetings and has since submitted the position paper, which is now informing the discussion that is going to be here for the next 2 days. Your Excellency, the position paper on the rising wage bill provides a basis to begin evidence-based debate on the status of the public sector wage bill. This is based on the realization that the current trajectory of the wage bill is unsustainable and is inhibiting the country's potential to achieve Vision 2030 and is rolling out medium-term plans. The position paper further explores the trends in the public service wage bill in Kenya over the years and undertakes a comparative analysis of the same in contrast with peer African countries as well as the private sector, while reviewing the implications of the rise on Kenya's fiscal position. Your Excellency, Various factors have contributed to the rising wage bill we have witnessed over the last few years. First and foremost, there has been a significant rise in employment in the public sector. New public sector jobs increased by 58,700 between 2008 and 2012. Most of these were teachers, police, and nurses. The implementation of the Constitution also saw a significant number of new institutions created, and subsequently, the resultant high numbers of new office holders paid from the public coffers. The situation of the rising wage bill has also been compounded by the various industrial wage demands by workers through their unions and the collective bargaining agreements to which we have been committed. Your Excellency, as we embark on this discussion, let me highlight a few areas that will require an honest and candid interrogation by Kenyans to agree on a common way forward. First, the public service should be recalibrated as an enabler of economic development. To do this, we need to revisit staffing norms, the performance management framework, and the business processes within the public sector. We need to ask ourselves critical questions on how we work and why we do the things we do. In addition, we require to strike a balance between attracting the best talent vis-a-vis crowding out the private sector in the labor market. It is important that wages are set based on fair valuation of the task. However, this should be balanced with realistic appreciation of the level of economic development and the productivity required to increase economic output. When we do this, we will ensure that we unlock the potential of our human capital while maintaining a sustainable balance between investing in the productive capacity that will ensure our human resource capacity is deployed efficiently and effectively. Let me now take this opportunity, Your Excellency, to invite my colleague, C.S. Rotich, to make his remarks, and thereafter invite the Deputy President. Thank you.
Your Excellency the President, Your Excellency the Deputy President, Cabinet colleagues present, Principal Secretaries, Honorable Members of Parliament, President, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Your Excellency, I will be very brief since I'm scheduled to make a presentation on the subject focusing on wage bill and the impact on growth. But let me at the onset take this opportunity to thank the Salaries and Remuneration Commission for the efforts they have put to have this important national debate on public wage sustainability launched today. Your Excellency, allow me to say 3 points. First, it's already now public knowledge that the government's wage bill has been rising significantly over the recent past. All indicators of wage bill sustainability are now well above the average for sub-Saharan Africa and the East Asian tigers. Your Excellency, comparison with the East Asian tigers is so important because these are the economies that grew very fast in terms of GDP and social development over the last few decades. And since we aspire to be like these countries and become a middle-income country sooner than later, we have to manage our wage bill to ensure that the foundation for higher and sustainable economic growth is in place. Secondly, Your Excellency, prudent management of public wage bill is key to macroeconomic stability, competitiveness of our economy, and the ability of the government to provide quality services to its citizenry. Like other expenditures, civil service wage outlays are subject to constraints of limited resources and financing. Therefore, the wage bill have to be set in the context of achieving a sustainable budgetary situation, which in turn is important to achieve a high economic growth and poverty reduction, as well as low inflation. I'll be saying more on this during my presentation. Thirdly, Your Excellency, I wish to say that the Constitution and the Public Finance Management Law of 2012 has entrenched the fiscal responsibility principles in budgeting. As the National Treasury, we will ensure that the benchmark set on recurrent expenditure and wage bill is observed during the budgeting process. Finally, Your Excellency, in developing the wage policy for Kenya, we will be guided by the need to recognize productivity, fairness, and fiscal sustainability of the wage bill. This will mean a break from the past, where the government sought to manage the issue of remuneration in the public service through institutional pay reviews, ad hoc committees and commissions, and uncoordinated collective bargaining agreements processes, which over time has created disparities in remuneration structures and levels across the public service. Your Excellency, with those few remarks, let me now take this opportunity to invite His Excellency the Deputy President to make his remarks and invite you to address this gathering. Thank you.
Your Excellency, the President of the Republic of Kenya, distinguished leaders, ladies and gentlemen. Your Excellency, clearly, the subject we are discussing this morning is a difficult one, because I can see even the clubs in between are very few. And it demonstrates that this is one occasion where, as Kenyans, we must be ready to take the bull by the horns. Difficult as it may be, this is a conversation we must have. Because it is said that insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. So it's upon us. And upon us collectively and individually as a country, whether we want to have this conversation or whether we want to have business as usual. That is one decision that we must make. And we have chosen, under your leadership, Mr. President, that this is one conversation, one dialogue, one debate that we must have, because this is our country and it's upon us to make this country greater. When we went to the elections a year ago, Kenyans made a decision on the basis of the pledge that we are going to expand our economy by double digits and sufficiently to be able to create jobs. Under your leadership, Mr. President, we have laid out a comprehensive plan on how to expand our economy. We've laid out plans on investments in infrastructure, from rail to road to our airports, to make it cheaper for business, investors, and entrepreneurs to do business in our country by reducing the cost of transport and the cost of movement. We've singled out the one critical factor of energy as a bottleneck that makes Kenya an uncompetitive destination because of the cost of power. And we have identified that we are going to generate 3 times more energy than we have generated in 50 years in just 40 months. In the next 40 months, it is in our plan that we generate 3 times as much energy as we have generated in the past 50 years, because we believe that by generating more energy and making sure that we reduce the cost of that energy by 40%, we will encourage more industries, more investors, more entrepreneurs to invest in our country, create more industry, and expand more jobs for our young people. We have laid out plans on how to reduce the cost of living in our country. Your Excellency, we've put government money in subsidizing seeds, subsidizing fertilizer, and investing heavily in irrigation. Because there is no magic in reducing the cost of food in our country. It is a simple function of supply and demand. The reason why we are investing this money is so that we can create or expand production, increase supply, and naturally, the demand and the prices will come down. We've put more money in security. And what has not happened in this country in 50 years, in one shot, we bought 1,200 vehicles, and the effect of equipping our security men and women with the correct equipment, the modernization program, is beginning to be felt in the country. All this, ladies and gentlemen, with many other programs that we have put in place, are meant to reduce the cost of living, to make Kenya competitive for investment, so that we can expand our economy and get jobs for millions of Kenyans. But even as we do this, we must have this conversation about the public wage bill sustainability. The rest we can do as government. This one, we must have a national conversation, debate and dialogue, so that we can all read from one script. The public wage bill at the moment is 13% of our GDP. At the rate at which it is growing, in 2 years, it will be 15.4 of our GDP, if we don't do anything about it now. International best practice inform us that for developing countries, it should be 7% of GDP. In the more developed countries, it can go as high as 8.5% of GDP. We are double the international best practice. That is why we must have this debate. This is not the time to apportion blame that it was created by this sector or that government or the other. This is our country. History has given us the moment that we are here today, and it is in our best interest that we have this debate. Today, 56% of ordinary revenue is used to pay salaries. It is projected that as things go, or at the rate at which it is growing, it will go to 64% in another 2 years. As we are talking today, 74% of our budget goes to recurrent expenditure. Only 26% remains for development. Ladies and gentlemen, if we have to take this country to a middle-level income economy by the year in the next decade, we must up our game. We are called upon, and Mr. President, on this one, you have our unqualified support to provide the way forward, because this is one debate we must have as a country, and it is upon us, all of us, with no shades of where you stand, your political persuasion, whether you are in the opposition or government, irrespective of regions and religion and races, we must have this debate. Ladies and gentlemen, I do not wish to say more than that. It's now my pleasure and humble duty to ask His Excellency, the President of the Republic of Kenya, to initiate this dialogue. Mr. President.
Thank you very much, William. Like you, I note that today the clubs are few and very far between. Lakini lazima tuendelee. Fellow Kenyans, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, let me say that I'm pleased and indeed very humbled to see so many distinguished guests and Kenyans at the opening of this very important forum. I take this opportunity to thank the Salaries and Remuneration Commission under the chair, Sarah Sarem, and all the organizers. And indeed, I thank each and every one of you for participating with us in this vital national debate. Let me, at the very onset, make it clear that my government's view regarding the size of our public sector wage bill. My government is indeed convinced that the recent growth in public sector wage bill is both unsustainable and unacceptable. In the current financial year, for example, we estimate the total remuneration to the public service will account for 55% of our tax revenue and 13% of the total national cake, which economists prefer to refer to as gross domestic income. Indeed, ladies and gentlemen and fellow Kenyans, if we maintain this trend, we will be dedicating an even larger share of the wealth we produce as a country to the remuneration of public servants. I say this and acknowledge from the very beginning that yes, indeed, it is good to pay our people well, but this must be done in a manner that is conducive to our development agenda. Yes, indeed, it is nice to receive even larger slices of our national cake. But collectively, as a country, we must also recognize that we have other priorities. We must fund our pledges to various capital investments laid out in the current 2030 medium-term plan. We need, as an example, to develop our roads, to revamp our health facilities, to build a standard gauge railway, which, as the Deputy President has said, will lead to a reduction in the cost of transport and goods. We must implement the South Sudan-Ethiopia Transit Corridor that will open up 3/4 of Kenya to new investment and economic opportunities. We must invest in irrigation in order to achieve our food security goal. But the slice of our national cake devoted to development expenditure would and will continue to dwindle if we do not contain the pressure on wages. Indeed, in a contest between expenditure on public servants, wages, and expenditure on capital investment that benefit every Kenyan, including future generations, there can be only one winner, and that is Kenya. Ladies and gentlemen, I have cited a few of the programs that will help achieve our Vision 2030 objectives. That is the path to a free and prosperous country, which we all, I believe, are confident to become. But we must also admit our current wage bill is an obstacle standing squarely in our path. The monster threatens not just our future, but our present too, since it compromises the stability of our present economic framework. We have consistently worked hard to tame inflationary pressure, so alleviating the secondary effects of wage demands. Our success in containing inflation also relies heavily on our ability to maintain a reasonable level of fiscal deficit. However, this success cannot be sustained if we allow a large and rising fiscal deficit to stoke inflation, exchange rate depreciation, and more expensive debt servicing. So far, Kenya has managed to maintain its fiscal deficits at fairly sustainable levels, and in consequence, our macroeconomic situation has remained relatively stable. By any estimates, our core inflation has remained low and our exchange rate stable. And our debt to GDP ratio is sustainable even by the most exacting of IMF standards. These are the fruits of prudent fiscal management over the last decade, which we can no longer take for granted. And that is why the threat of the burgeoning wage bill must be contained. It is time to put the monster to rest, and we wish to lead by example. Only last week, my deputy and I resolved to take a 20% pay cut. We were joined by members of our cabinet, as well as our principal secretaries, who agreed to match our effort with a 10% pay cut. We meet here today to see what more we, and indeed all of us together, can do to carry that effort forward. Ladies and gentlemen, I know that there have been some informal discussions proposing various measures to tackle the problem of wage bill. Some of the solutions proposed will not work, while others, I believe, will yield results if implemented. There have been, for instance, suggestions to raise tax to cover the wage bill. I say we should resist this enticement, and I say so because our ease of doing business would suffer with disastrous consequences for youth unemployment. The better course is to clearly set out a number of issues the nation must face and to see what consensus we can reach. Let me provoke some thoughts. First, though it is true that public sector average wages may compare favorably with the private sector, when we add the huge sums the government pays out in allowances and other benefits, public sector wages actually outperform the private sector. We should therefore ask whether government would do better to adopt a consolidated pay package policy that covers all allowances, or whether it can retain the present system with stricter safeguards to stop abuses. Second, whenever real wages fall on account of inflation, we experience a secondary response through agitation for salary rises. We need to decide how We should adjust public sector wages to protect it from erosion by inflation, a policy which several countries have experimented. Third, we have evident disparities in remuneration in our public service at both the national and county level employees with identical skills and experiences are paid differently by agencies in the same government without regard to performance and productivity. At the cabinet retreat from which I have just returned, these discrepancies aroused the interests of my cabinet secretaries. I am informed that in a recent report by the Auditor General, some of the employees inherited from the defunct local authorities earned more than the national government employees, despite having similar qualifications. The same audit found counties paying new employees different wages from the same skills and the same job experience. We need to streamline the management of salaries at all levels of government. Although the Salary and Remuneration Commission and the Public Service Commission will take the lead in creating rules and principles for containing the disparities, I would urge every Kenyan to make their views heard on this matter. Fourth, as you are aware, the government is now auditing its payroll to ensure that only legally hired employees are paid. We must get rid of ghost workers. In this context, I urge you all to give maximum cooperation to the Ministry of Devolution and Planning, which is carrying out this exercise. But more importantly, we need your suggestions on ways of reforming our pay system to make it sustainable and compatible with our long-run development agenda objectives. And fifth, as you are aware, we have already carried out the most comprehensive review of parastatals with recommendations of far-reaching reforms. Rapid implementation of these recommendations will help raise efficiency, save billions of shillings lost, reduce project slippages, and deal a blow to open theft. Open theft. Ladies and gentlemen, I have raised matters of grave national concern, but I would like to make it clear that this national debate on our wage bill is not an exercise meant to shame our civil servants, not at all. Let me remind all Kenyans that our public servants remain amongst the most competent and capable in Africa and in the world. They are devoted, patriotic Kenyans, many of them with world-class qualifications, who serve Kenyans with efficiency, dignity, and dedication every single day of their lives. And given the new innovations in ICT, which my government is introducing, like the Huduma centers, IFMIS, and so on, their service can only improve. Therefore, even as we weed out those who do not live up to the expected high standards, we must praise and reward the majority whose good work we all applaud. Ladies and gentlemen, in conclusion, I wish to note that Kenyans have in the past demonstrated their capacity to debate national policy rationally with a maximum of acrimony sometimes, but a maximum of will to reach a new understanding on such topical issues for the good of our beloved country. We owe our children a better Kenya, which they can inherit. I therefore urge all present to let that promise in nation building guide you in this debate. Ladies and gentlemen, like I said, and I wish to reiterate, if you will allow, this is the beginning of a tough debate. We can no longer sweep it away. We must discuss it, and we must find a way forward as Kenyans. I will not stand here and tell you that I have all the solutions, but I believe that together we can find the solutions. And I want to encourage you that let us not make this debate a political debate. I see my brother over there, the chairman of Kenya National Union of Teachers. Habari yako ndugu yangu. Nisitoke hapa sasa uanze siasa. Na kuomba kwa heshima kubwa, ukijua ya kwamba tunaheshimu walimu, ukijua ya kwamba tunapenda walimu na tunashukuru kazi ambayo wanaifanya. But we must discuss this agenda. Because failure to discuss this agenda means that tomorrow we may not have a country where our teachers have the opportunity to teach our children. So we must discuss this. And we must discuss it in an open, frank, and honest manner. Because all we are seeking is solutions. Because the truth is, and we will not hide from it, is that where we are, we cannot sustain. And tomorrow, my political opponent will stand up and say, huyu anaongea uongo. Ni sawa, hiyo ni haki yake, and it is his right, and they are right, because we are a democratic nation. But that still will not take us away from the truth. Because even if my opponents were standing here, they would be addressing you on the same issue. So I would rather we say, let us take a non-partisan position on this. And let us say we want to discuss this for the national good, for the interest of the country, for the interest of our children, for the interest of future generations, also for the interest of present-day generation. Let us discuss it in that manner. And I will say today that we as an executive, or as the leadership of the executive, have taken a decision to take a pay cut. Some will say it is a gimmick. That is their right. But I will tell you that we have taken that decision because of the solemn oath that we took before Kenyans, that we must and we shall lead by example. That is why we took the decision. To encourage and to incite and to develop this debate. And as I have said, we are also making major steps towards reforming our parastatal sector. And today I say this, that all parastatal chiefs will conform to what the executive has done. They will conform. And we expect that they will take an equivalent 20% pay cut as we have taken. We expect it, because it is our job to formulate policy. And we expect them to do it. And failure to do so, I assure you, there are many Kenyans willing and ready to take up those jobs at that lower rate. They are. And those who resist, bas, waende kotini, hata koti ikiwa award, it is cheaper for us to pay them off and get other people. So they should not think they are going to take us back. Mtu akubali, kama huwezi kukubali, bas, nenda utafute pahali ambapo wako tayari kukulipa huo mshahara. Lakini wa Kenya are no longer willing and are no longer able. And this is what we shall continue to do in all areas where we as an executive can take a lead. And let me tell you, in all honesty, that we're not doing this to hurt anybody, but just to provoke some thought from you. Imagine today, rather than say we want a higher pay increase because the cost of power has gone up, why can we not take that reduced saving, invest it into energy, so that we reduce the cost of power, reduce the cost of production, reduce the cost of goods and services, so that we make goods and services that much more affordable to our people? Isn't that a better way to move? Imagine if we could reduce, instead of saying we are increasing the cost or our wages because the cost of unga has gone up. Imagine if we could agree today to save, reduce our cost, invest in our agriculture, invest in irrigation, reduce the price of unga from 120 shillings to 60 shillings. That will help you and help the common mwananchi and remove the pressure from increasing wages. That is a much better way to go forward, ladies and gentlemen. Imagine today, we sit with an NSSF that has been collecting money and docking every single employee, saying that we are doing it for their saving for tomorrow. Imagine today, rather than investing in quarries, investing in the stock exchange that has no meaning to the mwananchi who is the one who is contributing. Imagine today if NSSF, because they tell us today they are looking for the highest savings, the highest return for the sake of the person contributing. But are they actually looking to see how that person contributing is living today? As a result of them looking for these high returns, they are forcing that person to pay rents that are completely unaffordable. They are making it impossible for that man to ever own a home for him and his family. They are making it impossible for that person to save even in alternative ways. Doesn't it make much more sense, ladies and gentlemen, if we were to say that an organization like that should be investing today to make available cheap loans to the watchman, to the factory worker, so that at least he is able to own a home today, while at the same time expecting something in his retirement. Na at least akienda retire ako na nyumba ya kuishi naye. Jameni, let us think out of the box and let us not presume that the only way we can make ends meet is every single year talking about increasing our salaries. Let's talk about reducing the cost of doing business. Let us talk about investing in more appropriate ways that makes a lot more meaning to our people today and to future generations. Ladies and gentlemen, that is not a Jubilee debate. That is a national debate. And that is why we are here to join you, to join all Kenyans, regardless of their political beliefs, their religious beliefs. We are all Kenyans. And we want a better place for us. We want a better place for our children and we want to leave this country better than we found it. Let us engage ourselves positively with a view of looking for a solution. Let us fight corruption. Let us fight all the other wastes and wastages that we have in government. Yes, all those are proposals, but this too is a problem just like those others. We must address it. We must deal with it. May God bless you. May God give you wisdom. May God give you courage. Hata sosio nimekuona. Very good. Hata wewe usinipige sana, tufanye kazi pamoja. Na sina shaka tutafaulu. Mungu awabariki nyote na tuwe na mkutano ambao utatuletea manufaa kwa taifa letu na kwa watoto wetu. Mungu na wabariki. Asanteni.
May we give another round of applause to His Excellency the President of the Republic of Kenya. And if it pleases Your Excellency, sir, I will now invite Mr. Linus KICC, the moderator for the program presentations and discussions, to take us through the presentations and discussions. Mr. KICC is the managing editor of the Nation Media Group Broadcasting Division, a seasoned moderator on public affairs subjects, a journalist, and a documentary producer. Your Excellency, sir, ladies and gentlemen, Linus KICC.
Your Excellency, President Uhuru Kenyatta, the Deputy President William Ruto, Cabinet Secretaries present, the Chairperson of the Salaries and Remuneration Commission, Sarah Serem, the Commissioners of our host this morning, the Salaries and Remuneration Commission present, and all protocols observed. This, indeed, Your Excellency, is a somber occasion. Just by looking around the faces in the room, the stillness of the air in the room, Your Excellency, this is a very somber, solemn occasion. The national wage bill, in your words, I can get some of the lines from your remarks, is both unsustainable and unacceptable. You've called it the monster that threatens both our future and our present. Deputy President Ruto said, this is a difficult discussion that we must have. He went on to clarify that 56% of our national revenue goes to the payment of salaries, the wage bill. The Cabinet Secretary for Devolution did describe this as a threat to our fiscal and economic sustainability. And Mr. President, I am in the habit of talking about elephants. And I know one when it enters a room, Mr. President. This morning, we do have one. This elephant, called the National Wage Bill. I know it's a national burden, but we are going to select a designated host of this elephant. And that will be none other than our Cabinet Secretary for Treasury, National Treasury, Henry Rotich, in whose office stays the national payroll. The Honorable Rotich doesn't need introduction, but I'm going to call him up to make his presentation, the first of a series of presentations that will be made this morning that will capture the picture on the wage bill trends, our current situation, and its impact on growth. Ladies and gentlemen, I appreciate the funereal mood of this discussion, but please manage some energy just to clap and invite the Cabinet Secretary for Treasury, Henry Rotich, for our first presentation.
Thank you, Linus. I have a short presentation here, and I think it will be loaded in the screen, but let me start that I'm going to talk about a brief review of the wage bill trends and the current situation. And the impact has already been mentioned by Linus, the impact of the wage bill, current wage bill on the growth and development, and issues about how it's crowding out other expenditures and sustainability issues. And then I'll make a quick concluding remarks. In terms of why are we concerned about wage bill? Basically because the public sector is one of the largest employer in many countries, especially in developing countries. So any remuneration policy is very critical for the budget and also the implication for growth and development. If the wage bill is very high, usually results in crowding out resources that could be used in other development priorities, especially the social and infrastructure development. This has already been well put by His Excellency the President, that we need to create space for other investments. Also, a huge wage bill also has a macroeconomic implication, and it usually results in large fiscal deficit because this has to be financed. And in financing that deficit, you ended up, if it is financed through printing of money, it will create inflation, and also a wage demands for more wages because of inflation, and you end up in a spiral. Also, if you borrow the money to finance the increased wage bill, we have unsustainable public debt arising from the high wage bill. And also the most important is the loss of competitiveness, because it makes the country more expensive destination to do business. And in that sense, and this is something we have been struggling over the years to ensure that resources, to ensure that we improve our competitiveness. So let me just say the recent trend. You can see in that chart that the wage bill has been rising continuously over the last 8 years. In fact, the annual growth rate over the last 3 years has been about 21% growth annually. In 2012-13 alone, it grew by 34%. This is well above the growth in the nominal GDP, which is 14% only, meaning that the wage bill is growing faster than how the economy is growing. And that can take us to a very serious situation. It is also faster than the population growth rate, which is 3%. So what it means is that the demand for services, if we measure by the growth of population, is that low, while we are growing at around 20% in terms of wage bill. So really, it's not commensurate with the growth in population. The other chart I would like to share with you is the comparison with the private sector. Based on the latest economic survey, the average wage earnings for the private sector, for the public sector, has now overtaken private sector, and is now in the ratio of 1 to 1.1. This was not the case about 6 years ago. In 2007, the private sector was paying higher than the private sector. So the private sector was paying higher than the public sector, sorry. Again, in terms of our per capita GDP, if we divide our national GDP over the population, the per capita GDP is now about 84,624. This compared with the public sector average earnings of 460 annually, it means that it is 5 times higher than a per capita GDP, per capita income, meaning that we are paying 5 times more than the average per capita. So that is a huge in international experience is around 2-3%, 2 or 3 there, the ratio of 2 to 3. So that's another main indicator. Now, in terms of the current levels of Kenya's public debt, we are now at total wages for national government, salaries to transfers to semi-autonomous government agencies, constitutional offices, and counties. The total now is about 538 billion. In this financial year was 511, about 12.6 or about 13% of GDP. If you add that to pensions of about 31 billion, it takes us to about 543. I'm looking at this financial year, and that is only 13.3% of GDP. If you add interest payments and external debt service of 203.9, it comes to 747 billion, which is about 18.3% of GDP. So these are sort of some statutory payments that we have to make. So that is the figure. If you take the current wage bill for national and all the functions transferred to county government, it now stands at 347 billion. And if you had the SAGAs, semi-autonomous government agencies and transfers to parastatals, which is government linked, it comes to about 512 billion. In terms of the composition of the current wage bill, majority is still in the national government, more than half. Salaries to semi-autonomous government agencies takes up another ratio of about 25%. Constitutional offices and state officers takes up, I think, something like about 2%, and the county or devolved functions takes up at about 12.5%. So in terms of the observations of the recent trend, just to summarize, is that overall, Kenya's total wage bill in the public sector has continued to increase in nominal terms. And this is due to the increase in the numbers. I think there have been an increase in employment and also the increase in the wages. So both has been rising. Another observation is that a significant amount of employee compensation is in allowance. Basically personal allowance, hardship allowance, entertainment allowance, risk allowance, etc. And this again had already been mentioned by His Excellency. So is this ballooning wage bill sustainable? Of course not. It is straining government budget and is denying the economy the much needed resources for infrastructure and social services like in health and education. In terms of the impact on growth, I think I've already mentioned this. It crowds out the resources for infrastructure, large fiscal deficits, and unsustainable public debt and the loss of competitiveness. Those are the four key impacts on the high wage bill. In terms of development, just to look at that chart, we are done very well. I think by 2011-12, the budget for development had increased substantially, but now with the huge increase in the wage bill, we can see development is starting to go down, which is not a good sign. In terms of sustainability, the next chart is that first, what do we mean by sustainability? I think it is important to define. This refers to the ability of the government to sustain its current spending, tax and other policies in the long run without strengthening the solvency of government or government defaulting on its liabilities. So that's what it means. It has to be sustainable. We have to be able to meet our long-term commitments. And we assess this. We assess this by making long-term projections because this affects the economy going forward. When we assess, we look at for those ratios that are in the screen there. We look at the wage bill as a share to GDP, which again, this I've mentioned. The wage bill as a share to total spending, the wage bill as a share to the domestic revenue, and the average government wage as a share of GDP per capita, which I've already mentioned, and net fiscal sustainability of the proposed wage bill. In terms of GDP, I think this is now been mentioned. Currently, total public sector wage bill is about 12.6%. Our medium to long-term target is below 8%, which is close to the countries that we want to benchmark with. If we compare that with the average for Africa is about 9.5, low-income countries is 7, and the middle-income countries is 8.5. So you can see we are way above that. For the national government alone, it is about 6.8, and this you need to add the counties. In terms of the ratio to recurrent expenditure to the total budget, this will exceed the ceiling. If you look at currently in the budget, I think what we have called there proposed is 71.9, almost 72%, while it leaves only 28% for development. And the targets in the public financial management law is that we should spend less than 70% on recurrent expenditure to total budget, and above 30% for development expenditure to total budget. In terms of the wage bill to revenue ratios, I need to correct that. Is the ratio to revenue ratios. It is now about 54%, and we are targeting to have that at 35%. If you look at the other African countries, the ratio of wage bill to total revenue is about 33%. Low-income countries is about 26, middle-income countries is 28, and high-income countries is 25. So you can see with our 53, we are way above what other countries are doing. And our target, what we are putting in the regulations in the public financial management, is a figure of about 35, which again, you can see we are still, even at 35, is still higher than the middle-income countries and high-income countries. Now, this is, I'm just almost coming to the end. In terms of debt sustainability threshold, this is based on our performance in terms of CPI rating, which is the World Bank rating. Our debt to GDP ratios should be around 50%. Debt to export ratio should be 200. Debt to revenue ratios should be about 300 there, and the rest of the numbers are there. So this is what we measure, whether if we surpass those thresholds, then we can conclude that our debt is unsustainable. Just as a way of example, we've assumed that if we grow at 5%, of course we are targeting higher growth rates, and inflation is 5%, and if the wage bill continues to rise at 25% annually, which actually did over the last 3 years, we've done some rough calculations, and of course, this would, if this is financed, because if there is no room to raise revenues, it will have to be financed through borrowing. So if that is the case, from our analysis, it will raise the deficit and will negatively affect the debt dynamics and put the economy at risk of debt distress. And this is even the challenge that Greece went into. The debt indicators also worsen and results in a breach of the threshold during the projection period from 2014 to 2013. That is using those assumptions and looking at it vis-a-vis those thresholds. Therefore, we can conclude that the current wage bill is fiscally unsustainable. Just to look at the numbers in the next slide, that is, you can see if we make those assumptions that I've just done, if the economy grows at 5, inflation at 5%, and the wage bill continue to rise by 25%, our debt to GDP would be about 55, which is well above the 50% threshold, and in that case we will be unsustainable. The debt to revenue will still be below 300, but still rising very quickly, and the debt service to ratio will be about 33, which is well above the 20%. So all this will lead to will make our debt unsustainable. My last slide is conclusion. So I just want to conclude that as we have seen, the wage bill impact on debt dynamics is negative, especially if it continues to grow like how it has grown over the last 3 years. Also, the wage bill impact on government revenue is unaffordable because the wage bill to revenue will be above the norm. So this means that any increase above the current levels will eat up more resources at the expense of other critical expenditures. In that case, it will be unsustainable. Therefore, the task is to contain the wage bill over the medium term through an appropriate wage policy that is fiscally sustainable. So I think this debate is very important, and this should result for us to get an appropriate wage policy, which should help us limit the growth in the wage. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Cabinet Secretary Henry Rotich, who is in charge of the National Treasury. The statistics are very, very grim indeed. And he has introduced the other element of national debt. That is the other beast that is lying right below this discussion. And I want to now take this opportunity to invite the Cabinet Secretary in charge of Devolution and Planning, the Honorable Anne Waiguru, to make her presentation. Honorable Waiguru.
Your Excellency, my presentation is, we adjusted it a little bit from what is in the program, is on the effects of the wage bill on human capital development in Kenya, and focusing mostly on the public service, and just to interrogate the efforts we have made with regard to paying wages and whether that is translating at all to productivity. I'm going to make it very brief and not repeat anything that my colleague has said. The Kenya wage bill status, CS Rotich has dealt with, so I will go directly to the issues affecting Kenya's human capital, the interventions we are proposing, and then I will pose some questions, since this is a national dialogue, so that the sessions that come thereafter may wish to interrogate some of the questions that we're raising. So, with regard to the introduction, we've already been given the numbers about where our wage bill is in terms of the percentage to GDP, government revenue, recurrent expenditure, and total public expenditure. If we go to the next slide, on the trend, we recognize that Kenya's trend is out of sync with the international best practices. What we are saying is that our percentage of the wage bill to GDP should ideally be 7, but we are at 13. And if you look at our percentage of wage bill to revenue, we are at 55, as opposed to the international norm of 35. Comparing that with countries in the region, Kenya's central government wage bill ratio is now highest compared to East African neighbors, except Burundi. If you look at those numbers, you will see a little difference from the numbers that you have seen from my colleague, but this is because the calculations and the data are from the IMF, and they do not factor parastatals and other commissions. If you include parastatals and other commissions to the percentage of wage bill to GDP, the number for Kenya moves from 7.8 to 13. And therefore, you can still see, compared to the other countries, that Kenya is way above what the other countries are paying in comparison to the economic standing. The next slide shows the growth and distribution of public sector employment, and the numbers again were addressed by my colleague CS Rotich, so I'll skip that slide and then go straight to the trend and distribution of public service wage bill. On this slide, you will see that the core civil service numbers have reduced to 23.6 billion in the financial year 2013-2014 as compared to 62.1. But this is because of devolution, and that most of the numbers in terms of the wage bill has actually gone to the counties. And if you look at the county numbers, we had in the year 2012-2013 at 4.2 billion, but that has risen to 71.2 billion. Now, if you add the county numbers with regard to the wage bill and the central government number, you have 94.8 billion in total. If you take the difference from what was previously there in the previous year, you'll see that the impact on the wage bill with regard to the county governments is about 15.4 billion shillings. So in 1 year, just by creating the additional structures in government, we have increased our wage bill by about 15.4 billion shillings. And these numbers are as of December. I'm sure as we are going on, the numbers are increasing. Moving on, the main reasons behind the wage bill, we all know what they are. There has been additional employees needed for better service delivery. We know we have increased the number of teachers and doctors. Inflation has also been cited as one of the key issues, and most of that inflation has been driven, if you go to the next slide, by food, rent and housing, clothing and footwear, and transport. Food is therefore considered as the single largest item of expenditure by Kenyans and one of the drivers that cause for a demand for salary increases. Inadequate funding of food production would therefore result in higher food prices and therefore demand for higher pay. In the next slide, we look at the issues of legal and institutional requirements have also been responsible for the wage increases. Collective bargaining, where public servants are unionized, such as teachers, civil servants, and unions, etc. The industrial court decisions have also contributed. The Commission of Inquiry on Public Sector Wages, the Waroyo Commission of 1980, also played a role, and various international statutes, such as the ILO. Going to the next slide, you see that according to the study done by SRC, and that has also already been addressed by my colleague, that the average public sector wages are now higher than those in the private sector. In real terms, this means that the public sector wages fell from 388,000 in 2008 to 346,000 in 2012. But they are still higher than those in the private sector, as you will see in the next slide. If you look at that next slide, you will see that in terms of how much money we are paying in the public sector, in 2008, we paid 369,439 as annual salaries, but in 2012, we are at 420,578. This is the average pay of a civil servant per year in the public service. If you compare that with that in the in the private sector, if you compare that with the public service, we are at 460,000, which is above by about 40,000. And if you look at the real wage, which is the total private sector wage discounted for inflation, you still find that the public sector salaries are higher by about 40,000 per year. Now, the inequalities in the wage distribution is key. Average public sector wage is also considered to be 11 times that of the per capita income. This is higher than the rest of Africa. The rest of Africa is at about 6 times higher. The gap also between the top public service on average wage and the bottom of the public service on average wage is very high. It's very wide. My key issue then on the issue of productivity, we have found that labor productivity in Kenya has been increasing very slowly. That is about 30% only in the last 11 years, despite these increases in the wage bill. And therefore, Kenya must raise labor productivity in the public sector. And I will be showing you a table that demonstrates that. Labor productivity indices in Kenya's public sector are much lower than the growth in wages. The wage increase rates in the public sector have been higher than the wealth, which is the value added created by the public sector. So if we go to the table, the next slide, I think it's not very clear, but in essence what it says, in terms of the total output, we chose to look at one sector, the agricultural sector, and in the agricultural sector, the reason we chose that sector is because it's the largest contributor to economic growth. In that sector, we use the year 2001 as a base. And if you look at the numbers, we have over the years from between 2001 to 2012, we have seen a total output in the sector that has increased by 30%, which is what I said. However, if you look at the output per shilling in wages, over those 12 years, it has reduced by 50%. So in essence, what we are saying is that we are paying more, but getting out less. Again, if you look at the labor input index, which is the amount of effort per worker, this is a calculation, it's a composite index calculated by looking at some aggregate indicators which include time and skills, how much effort is an individual putting to work, and then comparing whether the effort increases with an increase in the wage bill. And again, if you look at it over the years, it's basically the same. Actually, it reduces slightly. In 2001, you have an input index of 1, and whereas in 2012, we are 0.995, meaning that despite the increase in salaries, the effort that the public officer is putting in at work is not changing at all. So as much as we're thinking that it's an incentive, if you look at from economic point of view, and these are statistics from Kenya National Bureau of Statistics, and I think if you look at the analysis, any economist can look and see what how you calculate Kenya's productivity indexes. So the question then, is it just an issue of inflation, and how do we start using our wage bill to impact on the productivity in the public service? And finally, on the question on the output per worker, which is the labor productivity index, you look at the productivity, it has increased by 30% despite the increase in the effort. And this is explained by increase in technological input. It's not so much the individual in terms of skills, but the use of computers and additional technology. And therefore the conversation with regard to government, whether we should be looking at increasing certain inputs within the public service to ensure that we increase productivity. I think, as has been indicated, I think I've explained all those slides. The thing that we would want to talk about is the issue of productivity increases within existing quantum of personnel expenditure is very critical. So therefore, we start interrogating just not an issue about wage bill, but how does this wage bill then translate to increase productivity in the public service? And how do we continuously measure that? And this is just for the agricultural sector. And we assume that it would be the same across all the sectors because this is also a key sector in the public service. We also have seen that productivity can be enhanced by putting together an appropriate skill mix as well as redirecting funds from personnel expenditure to complementary inputs such as equipment and infrastructure to raise overall productivity, because clearly it doesn't necessarily mean that when you increase the wages that the output or the effort is increasing, but that this increase in productivity has actually been driven by things outside the increase in the wage bill. We also are of the view that effective skills development, which is in connection to education, especially to technical training to labor markets entry and labor markets entry to workplace, and lifelong learning will be useful in sustaining productivity growth and translate that growth into more and better jobs. We also looked at the issue of how much we have spent in terms of training public servants. There is a need to provide targeted training that we recognize and to ensure that there is a payoff in terms of the productivity. If you look at the numbers over the years, clearly if there is no output based on the issue of skill, that means that therefore the money that we're spending in educating civil servants is not translating to any productivity, because the index in terms of looking at the input of the worker, we looked at both the skill and effort, and both of them did not have an impact at all with regard to productivity. So the question we'll be asking ourselves is it that we are looking or structuring our training for public service wrongly so that we are not able to actually get anything out of it, or do we need to review and look at how much we direct with regard to training in the public service, and to what exactly do we direct to get productivity? So those are the numbers. The 13 billion is composite of all other ministries and all the training. And how much money that we're spending per year is a huge amount of money. And if you consider that you have no impact with regard to how much you're putting in, then the government needs to ask itself whether this is how we want to spend the money that we have put in training, or maybe restructure our training to be a little bit more effective. I'll skip the next slide because I think I've talked about the skill mix and the staff contingent. No, I think this is important. Another critical factor affecting productivity is the skill mix and staff contingent. We have situations where you have one technical staff supported by about 5 or so non-technical staff. So it's not on average with everyone, but especially at the senior level, you find that you can have one senior staff supported by 5 or so staff members. This not only slows down the business process, but represents an inefficient resource allocation system. A business process reengineering is required, and this is one of the things that we might want to ask ourselves. While we are restructuring the issue of the wage bill, should we also look at the structure of the public service in terms of personnel and the cadres and the ratios that we have and set them so that we do not have a situation where you have one officer having 5 support staff who are not adequately engaged, and that's why when you look at the numbers in terms of productivity, you don't see any increase at all, because the productivity is actually delivered by only the technical staff as opposed to just having a support staff. And we are already looking at that when we look at the issue of public service reform and Huduma centers. We are redirecting resources from support staff and clerks to go and serve in Huduma centers where they would be at least more productive in terms of contributing to the overall economy. Again, public spending growth needs to be moderated in order to stabilize economic growth, and to promote growth, development, and stimulate economic activity. The budget should therefore invest on building capital, but building it appropriately. And then a lot of focus has been placed on the need to build physical capital, including infrastructure, such as roads, but it should be recognized that human capital is particularly key in a country like Kenya, where there is a youth bulge and a significant scope for economic expansion. So bearing that in mind as well as we're having this conversation. Investment in education, health and communication and information technologies will play an important role. And it's estimated, according to various studies, that 50%, for example, of the US productivity acceleration in the 1990s was as a result of ICT. And therefore, adoption of new technologies could be one of the ways that we increase our productivities. There is a great deal of empirical research that reveals a strong correlation between education and aggregate productivity, especially in a dynamic environment. If we do not invest in educating young people, we limit our ability to build a vibrant and globally competitive economy that will drive the achievement of Vision 2030. And so the other issue that would be important to look at is also factors such as health and nutrition, and therefore focusing the public sector to exist as an enabler of the economy. I'll move to the next slide. Where the public sector wages outstrip private sector wages, this is really not sustainable. There is also a need to balance between attracting the best human resource and ensuring that human resource is distributed in the most efficient way in the economy to distribute growth. Now, on some of the interventions, this is my second last slide, that we are proposing as a ministry. One is to undertake the comprehensive rationalization and a conversation building out from this discussion today, supported by the Public Service Commission on the structure of the public service. We are also going to be doing the normal things that we're doing with regard to the payroll audit. We have been working on ensuring the capacity building framework that we're using to train civil servants, both at the national level and the county level, is harmonized and actually more useful and productive, so that we're not taking resources to places which are not useful. And now for the some of the pressing policy questions that I would suggest, considering that this is a dialogue forum, is a question that maybe we need to ask ourselves about the wage bill. Should the public sector wage bill be tied to inflation or to productivity? That's a question that we may want to ask ourselves. Should we, regardless of whether we are getting anything out of the public service, out of in terms of productivity, increase the wages, or should we tie the increase in public service wages to productivity? The second question I would ask is, how should we reform the wage rises coming through legal and institutional channels, especially because of collective bargaining agreements, and also because of certain institutional frameworks that have already been anchored in law. So in the discussion today, and maybe in the discussion groups, you might want to have a conversation on how do we reform these wage rises coming from the institutional and legal channels. The third question that I would pose is, how does the public sector attract the best from the market without necessarily crowding out the rest of the economy? How do we ensure that in the public sector we attract the best and at the same time retain the best in the public service, but we do not crowd out this resource from the private sector, because ideally the public sector is supposed to be providing an enabling environment. And finally, how do we then wish to structure the incentive of wages so as to spur productivity? We may want to start asking ourselves, how come despite our wage increases, we do not have an increase in productivity, and how would we want to structure our public service to ensure that it's more productive? If I may suggest, one of the things that you might want to look at is it an option to have certain cadres of officers on contract, and you only renew the contract based on performance? That is a question and a discussion that maybe this team might want to deliberate on. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary in charge of devolution and planning.
This way, Your Excellency. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, we be seated. Linus KICC. Thank you.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, honorable delegates. The debate now continues, and we are still at the stage of painting the picture on the situation as regards the national wage bill. We've heard from two cabinet secretaries, and that is aside from the speeches from the president, the deputy president. We've heard from the cabinet secretary for Treasury, Henry Rotich, and we also heard from the cabinet secretary in charge of devolution and planning, the Honorable Waiguru. Now we're moving to the private sector, and let me reintroduce again the CEO of the Kenya Private Sector Alliance, KEPSA, Carol Kariuki, to continue, or rather begin, her presentation. Carol.
Thank you, Linus. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests. As I said, I will not go slide by slide because a lot has been covered by my previous speakers. But by way of introduction, allow me to begin by just painting a picture of where we've come from. And in 2008, our nation did experience an economic downturn due to the global financial crisis of 2000 and 2009 and unfavorable political climate of 2008. But beyond that, the Kenya private sector remained and remains most vibrant and dynamic private sectors in Africa. A world leader in sectors such as cut flowers, tea, coffee production, and significant player in areas such as services such as ICT and air transport. In 2003, the private sector KEPSA was involved in the formulation of the Economic Recovery Strategy, ERS, for wealth and employment creation, 2003 to 2007. This was one of the key documents that gave rise to Vision 2030. And in this strategy, the idea was to deliver a leaner, more efficient, and more productive civil service. A work in progress, and much of the discussion that we are having today. As the engine of economic growth, the private sector is equally concerned about the unsustainable public wage bill. The business community has contributed enormously to job creation, an achievement which would not have emerged without numerous supportive reforms by the government. According to the Kenya National Bureau of Statistics, out of 510,000 new jobs created in 2011, 20,000 were in public sector and 489,000 were in the private sector, a 96% contribution to the employment generated that year. Kenya's wage employment can be categorized into informal and formal or modern employment, both consisting of private and public sectors. The informal sector The share of the informal sector employment stood at 81% or 9.3 million in 2011, and that of formal sector 19% or 2.2 million, an indication that the informal sector largely dominates the total wage employment. During the period between 2008 and 2012, the number of those employed in the modern private sector increased by 14% from 1.3 million to 1.493 million, while in the employment numbers in the modern public sector increased by 9.8% from 586,000 to 655,000. This represents an average annual increase of 3.1% for the modern private sector and 2.5% of the modern public sector. Job creation in the modern sector maintained a steady rise in the same period, largely supported by new jobs created in the private sector. However, creation of new jobs in the modern private sector decelerated to 44,500 in 2011, but recovered to 52,900 in 2012. The modern private sector wage bill increased by 29.9% between 2008 and 2012, representing an annual average increase of 7.47%, while the modern public sector wage bill increased by 40.4%, as had been indicated by one of my former speakers, during the same period, representing an annual average increase of 10.1%. From this analysis, the following are the key observations. In the modern sector, the private sector remains a key player in employment creation in Kenya, employing double the number of those employed in the public sector. The growth rates in the private sector employment have been relatively higher than in public sector employment, as in the norm the world over. For instance, in the UK, in 2012, business created 904,000 jobs, representing 80% of the total jobs created in that year. From the employment wage earnings trend, it can be argued there exists a strong correlation between the private sector and the public sector employment earnings. During 2008 to 2012, the modern private sector wage bill grew at 29.9% compared to the growth in employment numbers at 14%. He's gone. In comparing the public sector and the private sector wages and employment statistics, a recent study by KIPRA, on comparative study on public-private sector wage differentials in Kenya, revealed that, one, the current magnitude of earnings differential is about 7,000 Kenya shillings, 7,150 per month for basic salary in favor of private sector for individuals with similar education and years of experience. However, when allowances are included in the basic salary, the gaps is in favor of the civil service by Kenya shillings 7,032. This includes state corporations, constitutional offices, and local government subsectors, when both basic and gross wages are compared with those of the private sector. Major disparities exist between public wages and private wages using the broad occupational categories. Wide wages differences exist within the private sector, with earnings even higher at the top compared to those of the lower cadres. There, within sector, vertical wage differences being greater than that in the public sector. The market clearing wages is distorted by pay structures in both the public and the private sector. So we are also in this game. The wage differential between the two sectors and within the sectors has caused a wage distortion in the wage economy. The principles of wage determination have been violated, and education and experience are rarely considered in wage determination, as CSO Iguru also mentioned. As for the private sector that contributes over 80% of Kenya's GDP, the rising and unsustainable public wage bill will negatively affect it in the long run. The following are a few practical examples based on economic theory of how the unsustainable public wage has or may negatively impact the private sector. One, there is interdependence of the public and the private sectors. Public education, health care, support services, and infrastructure lay the ground for private sector and overall economic success, as well as societal well-being. The rising Kenyan public wage bill has caused fiscal imbalances in the economy, limiting the ability of the government to invest in these sectors, which has significant impact on the productivity of the economy. Again, this CS Rotich did mention. For example, the below par government spending on infrastructure has widened the infrastructure deficit. Yet efficient, accessible, and reliable infrastructure is an enabler for sustained economic growth, development, and poverty reduction. Poor and/or inefficient infrastructure development makes logistical costs higher, hence increased cost of doing business and reduce countries' global competitiveness. In the Doing Business Report 2014, ranking Kenya stands at 157 out of 189 in the trading across border indicator, which measures, among others, inland cost of transporting goods. This represents poor performance, with the overall ranking for Kenya standing at 129. Similarly, reduced investment in education and health over the years has denied the private sector the opportunity to access the right labor force and increases absenteeism as employees seek required medical attention. According to projected figures by Kenya National Bureau of Statistics 2013, private consumption is poised to increase by 3.8% in 2013-2014, then decline by 0.6% in 2014-2015, and increase by 0.2% in 2015-2016. This is against expected investment growth of 2.2%, 0.3%, and 0.5% in those years, respectively. The increased wage bill stimulates domestic demand due to increased disposable income, and most of the money is likely to go towards consumption-based expenditure. However, this demand is likely to be directed at non-productive sectors, making the private sector engaged in the production lose out. This is considered unsustainable, and again we saw that with the Parliament Budget Office 2013. One of the key measures of competitiveness is the unit cost of labor. High unit cost reduces the overall competitiveness of a firm or a sector. Higher salaries are paid in favor of the public sector, the management and administrative levels, and according to KICC 2013, which in turn increases the cost of labor. To remain competitive and attractive top-notch labor force, the private sector has in most cases resorted to paying higher salaries. As a result, the private sector wages increase, profits are recede, leading to lower levels of labor productivity and job creation. The Public Finance Management PFM Act 2012 confines the government to borrowing either internally or externally in the medium term for purposes of financing development expenditure only. Again, this was mentioned. Consequently, the government has over the years been raising taxes to finance the increasing public expenditure, both recurrent and development. This has been the case in the county governments, wherein many had even started to introduce new taxes and increasing the existing taxes. Currently, over 50% of the government revenue is used to pay public wages. Again, this the Deputy President did mention. Taxes increase the cost of doing business, cost of living, and lowers profitability. This affects the bottom line for businesses and undermines growth and job creation by the private sector. Besides the rise in the current cost of living, the likely impact on tax compliance and the business climate would be heavy if not addressed. Raising income tax and payee causes a reduction in disposable income, stifling consumer spending. This is likely to impact negatively on output and employment growth. An increase in general taxes will also impact negatively on low-income households due to increased income levels, causing poverty levels to increase. With production of goods and services constant, high public wage bill causes an increase in aggregate demand for goods and services, which results to inflationary pressures. Again, it was mentioned. These inflationary effects undermine business growth and investment expansions. This leads to reduced potential in private investment. Similarly, the inflationary challenges may push interest rates by making the cost of borrowing expensive for new investments and expansion. Moreover, increased demand that arises from a high public wage bill leads to increased importation of goods and services to to meet the demand. This reduces the competitiveness of the local economy and increases interest rates, denying the private sector the needed access to credit to improve their businesses. As I conclude, let me mention, and something that the President did mention, that while it may not look like a big step forward for the President, the Deputy, and the whole Cabinet to take the first step in reduction of their remuneration, this is the right step forward. And as the saying goes, a journey of 1,000 miles begins with one step. And even in a company, in a corporate, it's the leadership that have to show the way. And I think they have begun the way for us to begin the discussions and changes needed. And some of the areas that we need to look at to add to what the CSS did mention. One is to discuss around the cost to live. The discussion has always been about the cost of living. And when you look at the cost of living, then we think about wage increases. When we think about cost to live, again, we go back to what the President mentioned. We look at the cost of producing basic goods and services. And that leads to, and that is what will lead us to identifying what those goods should really cost and for the public to be able to afford them. The discussions around the increased structure of government. With the new constitution, we both have the national and the county, and this is what has led to the blooming, the wage bill becoming even larger. And this is a discussion that cannot wait, but needs to be had now. And while we were looking forward to bringing resources and services closer to the public, we realized that this did create new positions for many more leaders, and thus increasing the wage bill. The other discussion is rationalization of the wages from the highest all the way to the lowest paid. And while the private sector is still grappling with this is a discussion to be had even at this level for the public wage bill. Global standards indicate that the highest paid should not earn more than 25 times of the lowest paid. Not many companies, not many countries follow this, but this is a discussion that we need to begin. Discussions around allowances. Again, this has been said before. And whether people should be paid for attending day-to-day work meetings, or if allowances should be left for official trips and board sitting and board sittings. Rationalization of the work done by the public servants and reducing overlaps and underemployment with two levels of government and with a large government that we had before in the coalition government, and rationalizing that and looking at where there are overlaps. And again, to echo the President, seeing what is the best way to go forward and whether golden handshakes is the way that will reduce this. This and more will start helping us to reduce this. The issue of tax collection, widening the tax bracket, then going only for the formally employed. These are some of the suggestions that come from the private sector that we would like to contribute to this debate and would like to see a lot of these areas debated this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Carol Kariuki, who is the CEO of the Kenya Private Sector Alliance, KICC. And from her remarks, a very concerned private sector, a sector that does contribute indeed 80% of the national GDP, a sector that produces exactly the same percentage when it comes to employment statistics, but quite concerned, and rightly so, about the shape of the national wage bill. Distinguished delegates, this session continues, and I would like to remind all of us that after this, there will be a session to be led by discussants who have been put together by the Salaries and Remuneration Commission. And that will be the plenary where your views will be quite important, which is why, as you listen to each of the presentations here, make note so that your contribution at the plenary can be also taken note of. Now, it is my pleasure now to move to another sector. Now, Parliament is one institution that has invited its attention to itself a lot when it comes to the question of wages. I now want to invite the chairperson of the Budget and Appropriations Committee, the Honorable Mutava Musimi, to lead us in a presentation titled The Public Wage Bill, Sustainability, the legislative perspective of that. Let's hear from Parliament, the Honorable Mutava Musimi.
Thank you very much, Linus. The Chair, SRC, this is SRSRM, Cabinet Secretary Rotich, fellow leaders here present, good afternoon. It is my great pleasure to join you today and to speak at the launch of this national debate on public wage bill sustainability. I wish to thank SRC for extending this invitation to Parliament, in particular to my committee. From the onset, I'd like to state that the ballooning public wage bill has posed unique problems for this nation, and especially with respect to resource allocation. Since we were elected and I was asked to chair this committee that has 51 members of Parliament, we have held no less than 70 meetings over the last 10 months. And a lot of these meetings have been exceedingly difficult. We were trying to understand government, understand the spending agencies, their priorities, revenues, expenditure patterns, goals and objectives. And as we sought to understand government, we kept asking, where will the money to fund development come from? Our role in the budget-making process has therefore been adversely hampered by the inflexibility that the huge public wage bill has posed on expenditure. This national debate therefore comes at a very opportune time. We welcome it, because the glamour of aligning the budget with the national goals as outlined in Vision 2030 will only be achieved if we free and reorient resources towards provision of economic and social services. We need to make sure that sufficient funds are made available for priority public projects. Indeed, the proportion of government revenues available for development programs is limited and dwindling. What this means is that our development agenda is funded by development partners and also from public borrowing. The implication of this is both clear and worrying. Our sovereignty will be undermined, and so is the nation's macroeconomic stability. As we all know, Parliament is now part and parcel of the budget-making process. We have a crucial role in the preparation, approval, and oversight of the national government budget and allocations to the county government. Indeed, the participation of Parliament at the budget policy level provides an entry point of shaping the policy discourse of this nation. In the 2014-15 budget policy statement, which I tabled last week, my committee will be recommending some measures that will be geared towards containing the wage bill of this country. It is also to be noted that the fiscal responsibility principles mentioned by Secretary Rotich under the PFM Act 2012 requires the National Treasury to prepare regulations that will recommend the optimum proportion of public officers' wage bill to national revenues. These regulations, I'm sure, will be presented to Parliament soon, and we continue to remind our colleague to fast-track the finalization of PFM regulations for our consideration. In reviewing the 2013-2014 supplementary estimates last week or thereabout, the Budget and Appropriations Committee sought and was granted the authority to incur expenditure on two items. One of those items is what makes us meet here today, because we had to make provision for this national debate. We made an allocation to the Salaries and Remuneration Commission with a view to facilitating this debate. We would like to see the public sector pay rationalized and harmonized, and we will continue to be willing partners in this endeavor. Second, and please note, We made an allocation to the Parliamentary Service Commission for the socio-economic audit of the Kenya Constitution 2010. The Constitution of Kenya 2010 introduced fundamental changes to the nation's governance system. These changes have significantly altered Kenya's political and social landscape. In particular, the Constitution of Kenya 2010 established a bicameral parliament, an extensive Bill of Rights, a devolved system of government, and independent offices and commissions. This new set of institutional arrangements has taken full effect during the last 4 years that the Constitution has been under implementation. To date, we have not had any comprehensive analysis or audit of the impact of the Constitution and of the country's well-being. Undertaking such an audit is now timely in light of the expansion of institutions and services, as well as experience gained in working with the current document during this period. In this regard, a task and finish working group will be established under the Auditor General and reporting to the National Assembly through the Budget and Appropriations Committee. The working group shall comprise 7 persons with experience in public finance, law, and public administration.
We're still coming to you live from the Kenyatta International Conference Convention Center, KICC Amphitheater. Here, we're just outside where the national debate on the sustainability of the public wage bill is ongoing. It has been officially launched. The debate has been officially launched by President Uhuru Kenyatta. He has just left the premises with his deputy William Ruto, and after launching and of course making their presentations to the conference, which is being hosted by the Salaries and Remuneration Commission chaired by Sarah Serem. And the most important thing, the key thing that has come out of the president's speech is that he has directed parastatals. Of course, we do remember what happened on Friday when the president, his deputy William Ruto, and his cabinet took a pay cut of 20%, just trying to set an example, and invited other state officers to do the same. And we have seen Sarah Serem, the chair of the Salaries and Remuneration Commission, also say that her retainer allowances as chair of the SRC should also be cut by 10%, also taking a 10% pay cut. And President Uhuru Kenyatta has said that the parastatal chiefs will also conform to that, and failure to which action will be taken against them. Sarah Serem did say this is on a voluntary basis, but the president did say very clearly that the parastatals will also have to take that 20% pay cut, and if they don't, the government is willing, to lay them off and hire others who are willing to take on those jobs on lower salaries. Let's just bring in financial analyst Karethi Muremi, who is part of these deliberations. In fact, he's supposed to be making his remarks in the next few minutes. Sir, what is your take on the deliberations so far, especially the president's saying that the parastatals have to conform to that 20% pay cut?
I think up to now, what I would say is that the silent issues in terms of the wage bill is not sustainable. The silent issues in terms of productivity is very low. And we're going to bring in the fact that we are producing at 30%. I think those are good and fundamental issues. In terms of the state corporations, what you call the parastatals, the question on whether the CEOs 20% or 10% is something which they can implement is a debate we'll be looking at. The challenge, of course, is to reconcile voluntarily and what would call the president's request. I would rather we look at it as an appeal to them, almost telling them, I've done it as a CEO. Can you also do it as a CEO? Can you demonstrate leadership from that level? As to what impact, of course, that would have in terms of morale is something that needs to be managed so that people don't feel like you're forcing them. Because then you can end up with the reverse part, which is what would call the morale part goes down, and therefore the productivity issues start being affected.
Now, there's a whole debate going on, especially on social media as we speak, as this conference is getting underway. many Kenyans questioning whether these pay cuts are enough or whether we need to do more in terms of cutting the wastages in government and corruption in government. What is your take?
I think the key thing is that we have to tackle the bigger issues. I was just speaking to the Auditor General, who is inside here, and I was challenging the Auditor General that this is now the time. Things like ghost workers should not be items that we are discussing. We are paying salaries to people to make sure that we don't pay ghost workers. Things like public wastage. Last year, the Auditor General did mention that we are losing as a country close to almost 300 billion. Now, of course, 300 billion is a very, very significant figure, given that the debate we are currently having is on figures of 500 billion. So if we are losing 300 billion, it means that we need to get to sealing those loopholes so that we have a bigger significant impact. The other silent issues is what the Deputy President and the President brought to the table, which is what should you be thinking? Should you be thinking the salary, which is the numerator, or should you be increasing the economy, which is the denominator? And I think the challenge which the President posed in terms of NSSF is a very, very good example. Should NSSF be investing in buying plots, or should NSSF be investing in giving us kidney dialysis so that you as a worker can start gaining out of those type of things? So I think there are those bigger issues which were of course hidden in the speeches, which I think as we go on between now and the evening, they will have come out as substantive issues for the people to debate. But from where some of us are sitting, the issues to do with the economy, duplication, what would you call paying for idle labor, those are the bigger bites that this debate needs to bring out so that they are then tackled.
And the Secretary for Devolution and Planning, Anwar Gordid, asked a number of questions saying that this conference should be seeking to answer some of them. And one of them was, should the public wage bill be pegged on inflation or on productivity? What would you say?
I think that one is already answered. Article 230 actually says the salary should be based on productivity and performance. So from a constitutional perspective, we who are constitutional experts, we already have the answer. Now, the challenge that you need to think through is that within the spirit of Article 230, there is a silent message that wage bill should be physically sustainable. Inflation, interest rates come under the banner of sustainability. Yes.
And we were talking about duplication of roles, what has been happening in some ministries with some of their roles going to the county governments, for instance, Kilimo and what's happening in the health sector. Just very quickly, what should we seek to do?
I think Anne did bring out a figure where she mentioned that because of the county structure, we have an additional 15 billion. Now, that figure she mentioned is the one we need to interrogate and ask, why should the figure be going up? And where is the people who are meant to be given the work at the county level? Because that duplication, the figure she's mentioning, is the one we are calling duplication. We need to interrogate also the very silent question which she mentioned, which is to do with the work they are doing as ministries. If we take now her ministry as a specific, she's saying we are going to do rationalization, we are going to do study of jobs and all that, but the same work is being done by Public Service Commission. So we need to start asking, why are you doing what the commission should be doing? Because remember, in her contribution, she also mentioned they have additional pay of another 10 billion because of the new constitutional commissions. So we need to start understanding that the spirit of new offices was to reduce the work of other existing offices. And that whole rationalization philosophy, the challenge, and I think this is a challenge to our own president, who will tell you the truth, given that the inside is also self-preserving itself. Yeah.
Thank you so much, sir. We shall be talking to you a bit more in the course of the day. Thank you. That is Karethi Muremi, the financial analyst, and that is Karethi Muremi, just talking about some of the issues that have been coming from this particular conference, which has been officially opened by the President Uhuru Kenyatta. He was here a few minutes ago together with the Deputy President William Ruto. And some of the issues, the messages that are coming from the executive arm of government is that this discussion about the unsustainability of the public wage bill, which currently stands at around 500 billion Kenya shillings. That is more than 50% of the total government revenue. Is that this is a conversation that Kenyans need to have. It has started from them. They say they are leading from the front, but it is a conversation that Kenyans need to have. The Sarah Serem-led commissioner said it is a conversation that needs to be had if Kenya is to make progress in terms of development, and then it has to be able to curtail the burgeoning public wage bill. We are here at the Kenyatta International Convention Center, the amphitheater, where this conference, national debate on the unsustainability of the public wage bill, is being hosted by the Salaries and Remuneration Commission. It is in two parts. We are currently on the first part. We have had presentations from the President, his Deputy, and the Secretaries for Treasury, Henry Rotich, and for Development, for Devolution rather, and Planning, and Waiguru, making their submissions and posing some questions which the conference will be seeking to answer. There is another second session that is from about 5:30 in the evening. It is a debate that will be, of course, live on the local TV stations. For now, though, we take a quick break, but don't go too far. KTN News Desk is coming up shortly.